Good morning, distinguished speakers and panelists, ladies and gentlemen who are joining us here in person as well as virtually. I am Karanpreet Kaur from the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, and I welcome you all to the G20 Energy Transition Working Group side event on low-cost finance for new and emerging energy technologies, organized by the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, the Indian Renewable Energy Development Agency, IREDA, and the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA. The event today will focus on the estimation of cost-effective financing for energy transition based on the future trajectory of emerging critical technologies, mainly hydrogen, offshore wind, energy storage, and carbon capture utilization and storage. The technical sessions will delve deeper into the needs, drivers, challenges, and opportunities for investment in critical emerging technologies and the policy framework required for the transformation. May I request the dignitaries for the inaugural session to please come up on the dais. Secretary, Mr. Bhupinder Singh Bhalla, Ms. Abha Shukla, Mr. Sunil Nair, Mr. Pradeep Kumar Das. Secretary, Mr. Alok Kumar, will be joining us shortly. May I call upon Mr. Pradeep Kumar Das, Chairman and Managing Director, IREDA, to kindly deliver the welcome address.
Honorable Secretary Amenary, Principal Secretary Energy, and CGM RBI on the dais, and the dignitaries, policymakers, developers, academia, friends from media, ladies and gentlemen. It is a huge honor and privilege for me to welcome you all to one of the most important, critical, and crucial program today. All along, we have been having the program on energy transition, energy development, decarbonization. We'll be going a little bit deeper down. The main and major challenging issue of cost part and especially the emerging technology space, how we'll be handling that. Once again, very good morning and very green good morning to you all. While all of us stand at an urgent, unavoidable, and most significant need of the hour on transition to sustainable energy for a cleaner, greener planet, there is a need to think beyond the conventional transition approaches, process, and procedures to achieve the stringent yet truly established NDC target set up by Government of India and policymakers of the world. One of the most significant challenges include availability of affordable, sustainable, and reliable financing options based on a win-win approach for the entire economic value chain. Today here we have some of the brightest minds like policymakers, financiers, regulators, and experts apart from the developers. I'm sure that together we can identify challenges, explore new approaches, and form innovative financial mechanism to unlock the full potential of new and emerging technologies. Myself, Pradeep Kumar Das, serving Government of India as Chairman and Managing Director of Indian Renewable Energy Development Agency Limited, which is the mother organization for RE financing in India. And I'm proud to share here that IREDA is the largest lender in RE financing space of those organizations who are exclusively financing green finance. Couple of days back, we got an input from our knowledge partner BCG. Perhaps we are the largest in world because who others are financing, along with other finance, they do green finance. We do only green finance. So IREDA is there since 36 years, serving the country for supporting and developing clean energy, which has not only become a concern for India, it is rather a concern for entire globe. We need to have an environment where we can live, breathe, and survive. The climate concern, which has gone to such an extreme level, if we will not address that issue effectively, probably our grandchildren will not be having a place to breathe even. Normally, this is a human tendency. We generate legacy of wealth. Time has come, we have to generate the wealth of green energy in any form. Recently, we conducted literacy on energy as part of series of programs of 36 years of existence of IREDA. Many things came to our knowledge, which we feel that we need to share that at school levels. Small example I'll give you, how these firecrackers in the festivities or other time has been reduced in particularly in NCR. The children are instrumental in that. And similar time has come, we should adopt that kind of approach in order to make not only energy development, energy transition, decarbonization, energy usage effectively. I want to express my appreciation to each one of you for being here. Your presence is a testament to your commitment to a sustainable future and your understanding of the significance of low-cost financing for new and emerging technologies. Why we are talking of finance? If you look at the established RE technology, during construction period, the finance cost is not that significant. Construction period is pretty smaller in comparison to conventional energy. But post-commissioning, 1 year or couple of years of operations, then finance cost becomes the significant part. So therefore, we need to sit, discuss, deliberate, and share each other's concern and come out for a win-win solution to address these challenges. Let us seize this opportunity to learn, collaborate, and drive meaningful change. Together, we can shape a future where renewable energy is not only sustainable, but also economically viable for all. Thank you, and once again, I welcome you all to this program. And I'm sure with your active participation, we are going to be quite successful at the end of the day. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Das. May I now request the dignitaries to please grace the occasion by the lighting of the ceremonial lamp.
शुभं कुरु त्वं कल्याणं presidency on this important theme of finance for the development and deployment of new and emerging energy technologies. This side event is important to accelerate RE deployment. We need to strengthen policy commitments as policy and regulatory stability, transparency, and predictability are fundamental to attracting investment and driving. Secretary, Ministry of Power. As you know, the negotiations have started on the communique, and we requested him to join him. Actually, just at the right time. I think he's come, and we welcome him on stage. I hope we gain more insights from today's discussion with the experts into the way forward toward an achievable, sustainable, and just energy transition. Thank you, and look forward to a meaningful and engaging dialogue today.
Thank you, Mr. Bhalla. May I now invite Mr. Alok Kumar, the ETWG Chair and Secretary, Ministry of Power, to kindly deliver the keynote address.
Good morning, all our colleagues on the dais, distinguished participants. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this third Energy Transition Working Group meeting in Mumbai, Maharashtra, and specifically to this side event on this very relevant topic of low-cost financing for new. If you see the priorities which India's presidency has put forward before the G20 community, there are two aspects which stand out. First is the need of the universal energy access to clean energy, and the global commitment to see that while we accelerate our efforts for energy transitions, we also see that nobody is left behind, and there is emphasis on ensuring the universal access to clean energy, and those are our important priorities. But at the same time, we are also very conscious that while we take everybody along, we prepare ourselves in time so that the technologies are available for the greater challenges we are going to face in terms of deep decarbonization and in terms of need to address the hard-to-abate sectors. See, the presently available and taking forward the SMRs in the atomic energy-based generation. An associated priority is to sit together and find out what we require in terms of financing, because as we know from our experience, initial support is very critical to scale up any new technology. Let me give you this example of what has happened in India. We were working in around year 2008 and 2009 on the 20 gigawatt of solar energy mission. Now we are talking of 500 gigawatt of this. This 20 gigawatt was appearing to be a Herculean task. We have Madam Gauri Singh here, and we were in the team. The cost of the photovoltaic based solar energy was something like rupees 70 to 18 Indian rupees 18 per unit, and solar thermal was around 13 rupees per unit. So we were struggling how to push it. So a lot of public financing went into to buy those costlier energy, And if you see the Gujarat was the leader that they scaled up. And the lending community also came along. And today we have the result of the sharp reduction in the cost of solar-based PV energy from that 18 rupees to now around 2 rupees per unit. This is one example I want to give. The initial support, whenever you have a new technology which has a promise, it can't be really adopted widely unless until we all work together to scale up. And scaling up requires a lot of funding in terms of VGF and other supports, other public support, and also lending, a priority lending. So several countries have their own framework for identifying new technologies for priority lending. For example, India is formulating a scheme for supporting emerging energy efficiency but expensive technologies. And we are going to give interest subvention. That is one scheme on the table. So this priority is very important, and the work which has been led by MNRE in this priority is very significant. We also have one question that this is the work which the green finance track should do, why energy is getting into. So our response has been that we know our need the best. So we are not saying that how much finance from where and in what manner will be mobilized and will be provided. This group, energy transitions working group, is working on identifying the priorities and some estimates, the needs of our financing needs, and present it to the leadership of G20, that if you want to succeed in fighting climate change, of which energy transition is the most important part, this is the requirement of the low-cost finance for promoting these technologies. So India's presidency is well thought, our priorities are well thought out, the technologies and also the low-cost financing required. I'm very sure the study report which we are going to release will give us a lot of actionable recommendations, a lot of insights, and various possible models, what all interventions are required. Let me share this in today's presentation. One of the things was the de-risking, the presentation by IEA that showed that the cost of finance varies significantly in developing countries. And so like India, we know the cost of finance varies even from state to state, the perception, the investor's perception about the risk. So whenever there is a bidding taken by the national organization like Solar Energy Corporation of India, the tariff you recover is around 20 paisa less than if you do the bidding at a state level like I was doing in Uttar Pradesh. So there are definitely, to some extent, we can go on the basis of the de-risking of the projects. We need proper regulatory framework, proper payment security, and also a robust framework to see that the contracts are honored and implemented in the true spirit. Then the investor will come and the cost of finance will be less. But that will not only suffice. That will not fully suffice. De-risking will take us to some extent. We actually need sizable public finance to bring down the cost of financing for the clean energy projects in developing countries, and that is where the most action will be required. We are also conscious, and we are, I think all of us have agreed, developing countries have their ambitions to grow. So in the business as usual, their ambitions will grow. If you want to achieve the global goal of containing the temperature rise, so the community, the global community, the leaders, the developed countries have to support developing countries. Otherwise, we will not be able to achieve the global goal of climate change, what we have set for ourselves, the Paris Agreement. So we have to work collectively and see that whatever is promised by the developed countries for supporting the developing countries in terms of the technology and finance, it materializes. We have to work together to see that what could be the interventions and what could be the modalities to see that these funds flow. India, as a leader and as a presidency, current presidency of G20, we have been able to sort out our financing requirements to a large extent. See, the expansion we have seen in renewable energy in India is being successfully financed, and even from the foreign investors, but that is not the case in many of the other developing countries. So as a G20 community, we have to see that many countries which are still just started moving ahead on the path of development. There is adequate fund flows to those countries, and the cost of finance is also kept low, so that the fruits of development are available to those communities, and nobody is left behind. That is all I wanted to say this morning, and I once again congratulate MNRE and NIRADAT for organizing this side event. And we look forward to your recommendations, because we have just started the process of our communique negotiation. Whatever the actionable recommendations from this report which we are going to launch, India as a presidency will be thrilled and happy to incorporate to the extent possible those recommendations in our communique. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kumar. May we now invite the esteemed guests to kindly unveil the G20 technical report on low-cost finance for energy transition, prepared by the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, in collaboration with the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy under G20's India presidency. May I invite Deputy Director General Ms. Gauri Singh and Director Ms. Roland Rouge to please come up on the stage for the unveiling of the report. A huge round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. May I request the dignitaries to kindly unveil the next two reports prepared by the Ministry of Power in collaboration with IIM Ahmedabad and NTPC Netra. The reports are titled Financing Needs for New Age Critical Technologies, Carbon Capture, Utilization and Storage, and Battery Energy Storage. Do we have anybody from NTPC Netra here, please? All right. A huge round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. May I now invite CMD IREDA, Mr. Pradeep Kumar Das, to felicitate our guests by presenting a memento as a token of our appreciation. With this, we end the inaugural session. Thank you. We now move on to the next part of this event. May I invite Dr. Roland Roche, Director, IRENA Innovation and Technology Center, to kindly deliver the scene-setting presentation on low-cost finance for energy transition.
Thank you very much. Dear G20 delegates, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for the opportunity here on behalf of IRENA to contribute to the G20 Energy Transition Working Meeting today. I would like to present the low-cost finance for energy transition report. Okay. Maybe yes. The renewable energy investments are still focused on a few technology, but it has been in 2022 kind of a very good year because 80% of the capacity expansion in 2022 was renewable. And continued acceleration in renewable power generation capacity additions must go beyond solar PV and onshore wind deployment. Offshore wind will need to scale up at speed and scale. Those technologies such as green hydrogen, energy storage, and heat pumps are also critical to coupling different sectors and keep the grid operation stable and reliable. Innovation is one of the main levers available to reduce technology costs, accelerate market penetration, and unlock required financial resources. For critical technologies, effective innovation frameworks are vital to scale up the deployment and bring down the costs of these critical technologies, which is inevitably important for the energy transition. Coordinated policies and actions to drive systemic innovations in enabling technology, business models, market design, and system operations to address the key challenges facing a specific technology in its scale-up. The overall share of renewable energy in the energy mix will need to rise substantially to meet the 1.5 degrees target. 150 trillion of investments will be required, with rising estimate from 132 in IRENA's veto from 2000 agreements targets. This is roughly 1.7 trillion US dollars more than in the current planned energy scenario. In a time of tightening financial conditions, it is even more essential to ensure the available low-cost finance for the energy transition, particularly for critical technologies. A significant portion of the investment requirements will need to meet by private sector capital, including commercial, domestic, and international sources. Partnerships between public, private, and also philanthropic sectors will be crucial to incentivize the active engagement of the private sector. Multilateral development banks, and just to mention a few here, like the World Bank Group, the Asian Development Bank, will have a unique role to play in creating blended financing structures. Yet existing low-cost financing instruments and case studies within G20 countries and from G20 countries can illustrate the support of designed public sector schemes in reducing private sector investment risks. You will find those interesting cases from G20 countries in the report. The costs of capital for renewable energy projects vary depending on factors such as financing structures, technologies, and market conditions, as well as country risk premiums. The three most important drivers behind the cost of capital are the country risk premium, the off-take risk, and also the technology risks. Other factors are also important, including the size of the domestic financial markets and its depth, developer experience, transmission access, and cost allocation rules, and others can be mentioned, as you can find in the report. Future work is definitely needed to better understand the drivers of the differences between markets and technologies, to inform policymakers on potential courses of action to unlock greater access of low-cost financing. To achieve the 1.5-degree climate goal under the Paris Agreement, the overall share of renewable energy in the primary energy mix will need to rise as high as 3/4. The majority of the funds required for the energy transition will have to come from the private sector. The lessons learned from the success of solar photovoltaic and onshore wind can be used to accelerate the scale-up of hydrogen, offshore wind, and also battery storage, critical technologies for the next stage of the energy transition. Enabling innovative frameworks that reduce the transaction costs of technology transfers and facilitates foreign direct investments have played a key role in accelerating the deployment of new and critical low-carbon technologies in emerging markets. The public sector is a critical catalyst in engaging and attracting the private sector investors and project developers under conditions that ensure the strongly required low cost of capital. Innovation is vital if governments are to scale up new and critical energy transition technologies. Along with economies of scale as markets grow, innovation is one of the main levers available to reduce technology costs, accelerate the market penetration, and unlock the required financial resources for the global energy transition. Mapping and understanding the drivers behind financing costs and conditions are crucial to gaining insights regarding differences by technology and country. Thank you very much. That ends my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Roland Roche. We now move on to the first technical session, the panel discussion on the outlook of new and emerging energy technologies. This session will provide an overview of the technology trends, the transformation required for pushing forward these emerging technologies, and how the R&D and innovation in these sectors will change the financing needs in the coming years. May I request the moderator and the panelists for session 1 to please come up on the dais. Professor Prakash Chandra Ghosh, Dr. Juzair Wasi, Mr. Desikan Sundarajan, Mr. Prabodh Acharya, Mr. Aditya Gupta, Mr. Thomas Christensen, and Dr. Ajay Mathur. The discussion will be moderated by Ms. Gauri Singh. I now hand over to the moderator.
Good morning, and I would like to welcome this very distinguished set of panelists that we have here, and of course, the audience. I know that there are many competing events, so thank you so much for being here. What you will really hear from this panel, which is a very interesting lineup that we have here of academia and research. We have the private sector, and we have very strong international experience that will come through experts who have not just the domain knowledge, but also years of experience. So let me take a couple of minutes to introduce my panelists. I have Professor Ghosh and Dr. Wazi, who are both from our premier institute, IIT Mumbai. We have a very strong showing from the private sector with Mr. Acharya, Mr. Sundarajan, and Mr. Aditya Gupta, who represents the steel sector, the offshore wind, and also the new and emerging technologies coming from the Reliance Group. And last but not the least, I have Dr. Ajay Mathur and Mr. Thomas Christensen, who are both well-known figures in the international world of climate change deliberations and also collaboration. So thank you so much for being here and for joining me here. Today's panel discussion has a great segue from what we heard in the inaugural session. And I hope the insights that our panelists will provide us will really set the stage for the next panel, which is about how do we bring the kind of investments that are needed, which were also part of the report that just got released. So maybe I can start with you, Professor Ghosh. Professor Ghosh, who is from the Department of Energy Science.
For having me here. I'm honored to be here. I'm very young, of course. It's a learning process for me. Of course, the topic I'm going to talk about, I'm not young at all because I'm working in the field of hydrogen for the last 25 years. Started in Germany, started with green hydrogen system with my PhD work. I did cost analysis of that exactly, that's the topic of this particular event. And that particular green hydrogen plant was running from 92 till 2002. And that time I finished my PhD, and outcome of PhD was that time it was not cost effective. So that was an outcome of my PhD. But after that, there was another outcome, what I told, that with time it will be coming down, the cost, and time will come when we'll be having a cost effectiveness, and probably now time has come. So keeping that in mind, when you are talking about renewable energy, one of the major drawback of renewable energies is that intermittent in nature. And storage is obvious option that we have to take for this particular technology if you are thinking of. And I remember that with my other colleague, most of you might be knowing, his name was Chetan, we were sharing the office. So I used to tell him that even if we give solar energy free of cost, still people are not going to take because energy is so expensive for storing. So keeping that in mind, so if we take different storage options, so whether conventionally lead acid, lithium and batteries, they are mostly very expensive when you are talking about the PV or renewable cost have come down to 2 rupees per kilowatt hour per unit. So there are other options which has now it is upcoming, and that's what also we are working is that flow batteries. And it is believed that probably for stationary applications, flow battery is one of them is going to be cost effective. And we can reduce the cost. Now when you are talking about the cost, there are two different costs always we talk about. One is the capex, but always we forget that the lifetime also is included there. So until unless we are doing the life cycle costing, we cannot actually make any comment that which one is actually expensive. So this particular technology, redox flow battery, what is coming up, it has an advantage because it's having much higher lifetime, even for conventionally what is available at this point of time, vanadium redox flow battery, that is consider that it is having almost infinite lifetime. And probably we can discuss afterwards how we can tell it's having infinite lifetime. So that is one. And other one is that what you think about is that the green hydrogen, which can be also as another medium for storage, and it's having actually multiple applications. And in the beginning, when you are talking about green hydrogen, people think that probably industrial green hydrogen, that will be the industrial hydrogen application. That is the first step where we can step in. And always it is being discussed that at present, at least if we talk about in Indian context, we have around 8 million ton of hydrogen that is being used in the industrial scale. And if we can replace that, probably that could be the first step. But when we talk about 8 million ton of hydrogen, probably we do not understand how much of solar PV. It is 300 gigawatt peak of solar if I talk about. And earlier in the inaugural session, it was discussed, even 20 gigawatt was actually a nightmare. That's what we used to think. I have to think that 300 gigawatt peak only for green hydrogen for industrial scale. Then if we extend it further, because the renewable has an opportunity that nobody will be left out, because solar reaches to everybody, whether it's a poor or whether it's a rich, everybody gets the solar radiation. So this is the only means that nobody will be left out if we have actual solar storage technology proper. So the next one, what I believe, is that the LPG in our country, that can be actually replaced with green hydrogen as a cooking fuel. And that requirement, if I convert it, is 19 million ton of hydrogen per year. And which comes, if we talk about in terms of the PV installation, it's another 9 gigawatt peak of solar PV. But beauty of this, that it is not of one particular system of 1 megawatt. It probably in few kilowatt system, that's what we need. So that's the second, and third one is the transport sector. Now, if you take the transport sector, there also green hydrogen can be also as a carrier of hydrogen, a carrier of energy from renewable. And if we take that number, if we put, there are two different ways of taking even green hydrogen in transport sector, whether we are going through IC engine, that's a conventional, other one is using the fuel cell. If we talk about fuel cell, today's date, for Indian industry, we need around 9 million ton of hydrogen. But if we put it in IC engine, we need probably 23 million ton of hydrogen. So now, as I told earlier, so you can also convert how much gigawatt peak of solar we need altogether. So it is probably sometimes when you are talking about these numbers, probably it's very easy to say, but probably it's very tough challenge in front of us to achieve. So with this, I would like to thank you.
Thank you so much. I think, the numbers and the opportunity are extremely clear from what Professor Ghosh just said. Even if you're looking at what the National Hydrogen Mission has planned, which is about 5 million tons of green hydrogen by 2030, and if you look at it in the context of what is currently being produced, which is 8 million tons, as Professor Ghosh just said, just converting it means that you need so much more solar PV peak energy to come into our grids. And that actually brings me to Dr. Wazi, who's Professor Emeritus in IIT Mumbai. He has been working on the reliability of solar modules, but his interest also pans into nano-crystal solar cells and nanoelectronics. So very happy to have you here, Professor. And I hope you can share with the audience some insights on where do you think the advancements in the solar PV technology is going, because that's going to be a very critical technology for whatever pathways we think, whether it's coming from the green hydrogen or only getting into the very ambitious targets that India has set for itself. So, Professor, maybe you can give us some insights.
Yes, sure. Thank you, ma'am. And again, it's a great pleasure for me to be here. As the word emeritus in my title implies, I'm no longer as young as my colleague here. But I would like to say that in the renewable area, I am quite new. I've really been working in the renewable energy solar PV area only for the last about 12, 13 years. So having said that, yes, ma'am, you're quite right that, solar energy, we know has been around for quite some time. In fact, has been around for decades, but really came into the fore maybe about 10 years ago. And as Secretary Power mentioned in the morning, really when we were looking at those numbers, 17, 18 rupees per unit in the initial years, it was really difficult to imagine that we could go even up to 20 gigawatts. But of course, that has changed significantly. And now solar energy, solar photovoltaics in particular, is kind of accepted as as a good energy source, and in fact, probably one of the least expensive energy sources. As the Secretary mentioned in the morning, down to almost 2 rupees or 2.5 rupees per unit. One might feel that it is actually now a mature technology and we should start looking at some of the other newer emerging technologies, and that's quite true. We must look at the newer emerging technologies. But what I would like to say, ma'am, is that solar energy itself is undergoing a lot of changes. A lot of dramatic changes are taking place, and we should capture those because solar energy is already there, it's doing well, and every improvement you can make is going to make the transition to clean energy even better and easier. I'll just mention a couple of them initially, although many things are happening. One of them is really the drive to achieve higher efficiencies of solar cells. This has great implications in terms of the eventual cost, in terms of the area which you will require to convert solar energy into electricity. And in the last few years, there has been tremendous work going on all over the world in looking at tandems, that is, combining two types of cells together in one structure. And these tandem solar cells, usually using silicon also, which is of course the mainstream technology today, but using silicon plus another material and trying to get to higher and higher efficiencies. So one of the most common of these, of course, is the silicon perovskite tandem. Perovskite, a relatively new material, an old but new material, old in the sense it was discovered a century ago, but really put into use for solar energy only about 6, 7, 8 years ago. But still it should come of age already. And these perovskite on silicon tandems are now showing efficiencies, albeit on a very small area of 30 to 33%, with hopes of going to 38% or more perhaps. So these are really dramatic numbers, and the kinds of changes we have seen only in the last few years, going from 20-something% up to, as I said, 33%, really gives us the hope that we will actually achieve extremely high solar cells for eventually for commercial applications. These are not in commercial use yet, but hope to get there soon. The other point I'll quickly mention, which ma'am, you referred to, is the reliability, and this is something IRENA has also been concerned about, the quality infrastructure aspect of the things which are going up, and this is something we should certainly look at. I'll just briefly mention here that today the solar panels out there in the field are supposed to have a 25-year lifetime, but that is also something not really a given because it depends on the initial quality, and this is something we must ensure. But the other thing is this 25 years, people are trying to push it to 35 years and perhaps eventually to 50 years. This is important because obviously it will reduce the overall cost per unit of solar energy and really eventually improve the financial models which really will go into solar energy. So these are two of the areas where I think there's a lot of R&D going on, and we must really try and strengthen that.
No, thank you so much, Dr. Wazi, because I think when in the last decade, the maximum that you were looking for efficiency, if it was in the range of 20 to 22 2%, it was considered very good. And now you're talking about efficiency that might go up to 38%, which is really makes solar into a technology that can really power the energy transition in a very impactful way. So moving from what we've heard from our two very reputed and renowned academicians who are working in the field of R&D, let me go into our panelists who represent the private sector, because essentially they are the ones who are going to bring in the capital and the technologies on the ground to power the energy transition that we are hoping to see. So let me first turn to Mr. Acharya, who's from the JSW, and he's the Chief Sustainability Officer there. He brings a lot of experience on the forward thinking that JSW has on green steel. So my question to you is, Mr. Acharya, that we've seen some very good news coming out of Europe on the large pilots and small commercial plants that are moving in the process of low carbon steel, especially in the electric arc processes. But with JSW, which has plans to become one of the largest steel makers in India, the blast furnace process actually involves a lot of process changes and a lot of investment. So, what are your thoughts on how the Indian steel manufacturing sector is looking at making these investments? Because you definitely don't want to be locked into long-term assets that are not environment friendly. So, some insights from you.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for that question. First of all, I always find very unfair to compare blast furnace with electric arc furnace. Just for clarifications that we are talking about steel making, so blast furnace is iron making. So in iron and steel, there are distinctively two processes. And the iron making process is the process where a lot of emission happen. And possibly we should compare how the iron making facilities over the globe is changing and how Indian steel industry is trying to change, and what possibly the plan for JSW. I will love to say that. But if you talk about electric arc furnace, that's about making the steel, which is, the technology is available, it is being implemented in India also. We have a lot of electric arc furnaces happening. Now in the steel making, if you see in India, we are contributing almost 2% of GDP and 10% of emissions. You are right that we are growing, and plan is to double the capacity by 2030 and triple the capacity by 2050. So therefore, we cannot double the emission and triple the emissions the way we are growing, and that's the challenge. What's happening in Indian steel industry, if you see, the majority, more than 50% of the steel is being made from the so-called secondary sources, which they don't even use the blast furnaces. The blast furnaces, the big blast furnaces where the iron is made, is used by the large players like JSW or Tata or SAIL. So those are called ISPs, or integrated steel plants. Globally, if you see the transition, why I'm comparing globally and India, and globally if you see steel industry is contributing to 0.7% of GDP and 7% of emissions. So in India, we are contributing more in GDP and more in emissions. The transition, what you see happening globally, what the examples you see in Europe, is huge, eliminating the iron making process, which is the emission intensity. That means they have a lot of scrap to remelt in the electric arc furnace. In India, we have a unique challenge because we are a growing economy where we need more steel. At the same time, we don't have a lot of scraps to melt. So at the same time, we have a lot of low quality of iron ore availability. So therefore, the natural process, because our steel consumption is less than 80 kg, whereas global average 3 times more, around 225 kg per capita. So we have a lot of opportunity grow in consumption of steel. So challenge is that how we can decouple the economic growth, decouple the steel industry growth with the emission growth. The natural transition will happen when we have efficiency improvement. And I believe putting up the Indian steel industry, the big players, including JSW, what we are doing, we are putting up large-scale blast furnaces. That means it is focusing on increasing efficiency, making more out of less. So that is where initially, if you see in the next 10 years, Indian steel industry will focus on reducing the emission intensity. But the way we are growing, whether the absolute emission will reduce in last 10 years, that may not happen. But what's going to happen, we see some promise in terms of how we can eliminate the iron making process with less carbon intensive process, and green hydrogen is one of the favorite in steel industry where we are looking at very keenly that when it will be cost effective, at the same time available at a scale so that we can use. For example, you might be knowing that in India, we have an Indian Hydrogen Association which we formed many years before, where we are promoting how we can use more and more green hydrogen in the reduction process so that we can make steel industry more clean. But carbon capture is another technology which we, from the steel industry perspective, will be keenly watching for, because ultimately we will be left with what you call the carbon intensive technology, where the investment will get locked up. And therefore, to abate it, the carbon capture and storage has to play an important role. So in both green hydrogen and carbon capture and storage, how we can make them cost effective. And that is a question of time and research, and that also a question of policy decisions. I strongly believe, being also in the steel industry, when you have a higher cost of carbon and the technology maturity increases, at one point, I believe it should be well before 2050, this technology will be commercially viable, feasible, and it will improve at scale, and it will be applicable in the steel industry. But question is, should we wait for that and we do nothing in the period? And that is where I believe steel industry is taking a lot of initiative, including the ministry. If you all be aware, the Ministry of Steel, I think the only ministry of steel in the world which we have a ministry, they have already constituted 13 task force to find different avenues, right from defining the taxonomy for the green steel. By the way, there is no unified definition of green steel in the world. And I think that is where India will possibly take a lead to define what green steel is. And the technology pathways, including skilling. So, holistically, Government of India is working with all the stakeholders to decarbonize this sector. So that work is going ahead, and that I believe will help, including creating a demand for green steel. But the other aspect from the private industry player, although we are putting up more and more so-called blast furnace technologies to use our own resources effectively and increase our efficiency, we are also looking at technologies where we can we work on the circularity of carbon. Instead of emitting it, because in iron making fundamentally, you have a reduction process where you take out the oxygen with addition of carbon. So can I use those carbon on a circular basis? So that's also we are working. So I believe there are interesting time ahead. Steel is a fundamental material and essential for climate change mitigation. Indian economic growth is associated with steel sector growth. We need to decarbonize the steel sector, so these are the facts we know. Technology is going to prove a very important key role in decarbonizing. But the most important lever right now, I think two levers, we talk about finance here, so I should touch upon that. So on the finances, when we come to the large player like us, I don't think availability of finance is a challenge. Challenge is the viability gap funding. Because if I use hydrogen, it is becoming 3 times costly than using the carbon. So where that initial force, that viability gap funding need to come to make that happen, so that the technological innovations and finance flow can come to a point where it will be self-sustaining. So that's our take, and in JSW we are committed, and we are looking at all technology. We are operating a carbon capture storage plant, and we are looking at how we can scale up. We are looking at hydrogen. We are also looking at the new disruptive technology which we have not thought of. For example, if we need to decarbonize, I believe everything needs to be electrified, and that electrification should be supported with renewable energy. That is the easiest way to decarbonize any sector. So, couple of things where we know there are startup companies we are looking at how we can do the electrolysis of iron ores with green energy and make this as a carbon free. So there also we are looking at and looking forward to support those kind of startups to come and change the way we live in the world in a carbon intensive world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think, this perspective coming from the end use sector and a sector like steel, which India definitely is a very major player in terms of the manufacturing base that is already in place, but also the ambition of ramping it up. Let me now move to Mr. Sundarajan, who's the managing director and the country head for India Equinor. And Equinor, we know, is a very large player in the offshore wind market. The LCOE in the European market is pretty much cost competitive. How do you really see this moving in the Asian markets and India in particular? And what's your sense of how soon would the offshore wind become a technology that also becomes a very strong pillar in the energy transition of emerging economies like India, Indonesia, and others?
Yeah. Thanks for the question. I think I want to rewind maybe 10 or 11 years, right? I was actually in Oslo last week, and we were having a management team meeting. And one of the questions that was asked to the audience was, when did we take a decision gate A on the floating wind farm in Hywind, Scotland, basically? And all of us got it wrong. The answer was 2009. So what I'm really trying to say is it's an evolution of many years of working very closely together with the supply chain, with the EPC contractors, together with the policy makers, when we actually got the costs to the levels that exist today. In fact, I cheated a little bit and I asked the same question to Dr. Mathur this morning. And he also made a very interesting point. I think the generation one of the offshore wind technology is heavily designed towards the conditions that prevail in the European seas, right? Those conditions don't necessarily exist in the seas in Asia. So I think there's a slight bit of tweak and transformation of the technology in itself that is needed. But what will actually prime the developers to do that? That's policy again, and opportunity. And unfortunately, there's the same set of players when it comes to developers, when it comes to technology developers, and when it also comes to installers. And the same set of capital is essentially competing globally. So in order for the scales to actually come down to where the European scales are today in an Asian landscape, I really commend the way MNRE in particular is looking at it, is awarding large blocks which will actually prod investment, which will also prod local supply chain development. And really the only way to do it is also in symphony. I always say this, putting an offshore wind project together is actually like an orchestra, where there are hundreds and thousands of people and players that need to work together in symphony. So the key is have a target, have a time-bound target, and everybody needs to work together. And that's the only way the scales will come down, including offshore wind turbine manufacturing, offshore services companies, and most importantly, the egress, taking the power from offshore to land. That in itself can be a challenge in many geographies, as we have witnessed. So yeah, that's really the recipe.
No, thank you so much. Because, I think there are many people in India who have been looking at the offshore wind and it taking off at scales for some time now. So I hope with the initiatives that are now being taken by the ministry will actually unfold this whole segment to come into prominence as we move forward. Let me turn to you, Mr. Gupta, who's the CFO of Reliance New Energies Limited. And, and coming from the finance sector and being a part of a private sector entity that's very bullish on both green hydrogen and other emerging technologies in the space of storage and others, I want to turn to you to ask you what are really the challenges you see in terms of lowering the cost of capital for these new emerging technologies. I mean, we did see in the morning the discussion that came from Mrs. Abha Shukla and also from Secretary MNRE and Secretary Parth, that the cost of capital, even in India, for some of the mature technologies is still high compared to the other developed countries. So what are the challenges you really see?
Yeah. So thank you once again. So having worked in this power sector now for more than 20 years, and if I just look at the context of funding for such projects, and you look at the spectrum of TRL, technology readiness level, projects that are low on TRL, let's say TRL 1 to 4, there's a lot of funding available. There are academia funding, there are government grants, and then a lot of accelerator funds. So there's funding available for those TRL projects. On the other end of the spectrum, for projects that are now proven, even solar in India is now proven, or onshore wind is proven. There are defined debt equity norms. You started with 70-30, today mostly people do 80-20. So there again, there is access to funding. It's become part of priority sector in India. Green bonds are the, government is promoting and encouraging companies to do those. It is in the middle where we have the issue. The problem of funding is in the middle, TRL 5 to 8 probably. And there then what is really the issue? If you really look into it, what's the issue of why is it difficult to fund those projects? The issue there is that as the technology is developing, and it is rapidly developing, there is a steep fall that happens in the capex. So a project set up in 23, if it is going to live a life of 15 years, and it has to compete with the project that will come up in 25 at half the capex, so that's the challenge. So the solution, therefore, is really, as I see it, in two areas. One is securing offtake, which in the arena presentation also it was covered. So securing offtake, now there are ways to do it. One is, of course, the simplest is to say that there's a long-term, sort of a long-term power purchase agreement. What we discussed, that 18 rupee tariff for 25 years. And that was true, meaning in 2007-8 and today, 15 years down the line, power prices have fallen substantially. So that is one route to take. But then customers today don't want to lock in into those kind of tenures. Today everybody wants short-term contracts. So then what do you do? So maybe an option to have a tariff which is declining, meaning you have a higher tariff in the initial 3 or 4 years, where it has to be tied up with some, it has to be based on some sort of a sharing mechanism. Either you call it FIT or, it's taken by some nominated agency which then supplies to customers. And after that 3 or 4 year period, it is left open to market forces to compete with the next generation of technology, which will come at a much lower capex. So that is the second possibility. The third, of course, is what the government of India is anyway doing, which is on the lines of RPO, which is for solar and wind. They intend to do it for green hydrogen, and that is another way to secure demand. So this is one aspect I think needs to be cracked if we have to have cheaper funding. The second part on funding financing avenues. Of course, incentive schemes like the government of India has launched successfully, the PLI scheme. But then what we also see today in India is that a lot of states, lot of these states are also very actively offering incentives. and they sometimes are much more than what Government of India offers. So there is some merit in probably for them to work together, the center and the state, and design packages which will develop not just that particular industry, but the entire ecosystem. Because you need an ecosystem for even solar manufacturing, or tomorrow for green hydrogen, or for battery. So if there is synergy in those incentives, it can give more bang for the same buck. So that is one. The second is, of course, viability gap funding, because higher capex means you reduce capex through government funding in the initial years. And of course, the funding from financial institutions, international IFC, ADB, and the multilateral financial institutions, which have access to low-cost funding. Primarily, these are the two. Just one last point was that we are also seeing in the last year or last 2 years, a lot of the developed world, especially in the US and in Europe, schemes that are being heavily funded by the government, incentive schemes, and those are to promote the green ecosystem in those countries. So while they do that, but I think as a part of one of the objectives of this forum, it is also important to see how it does not become a hindrance to funding the needs of the developing world, so that all move together and it is inclusive. So that's from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think, this whole concept of supporting not just deployment of technology, but also developing an ecosystem is absolutely critical. And, the ecosystem, of course, can get developed from a demand side pull, which comes from things like the RPO, or a supply side, like we see in the IRA. But let me turn to Mr. Christensen, who brings with him a lot of international experience. He's the climate ambassador for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Climate, Energy and Utilities. But I think at IRENA, we know him as a champion for the Global Offshore Wind Alliance. So let me ask you this, Mr. Christensen, that you've seen how policies are unfolding across the world, and but what are the early success stories that you're seeing especially in the policy frameworks that are supportive of emerging technologies, and which are good examples, good best practices for other countries to take forward?
Thank you, Gauri, and thank you for having me here. I had hoped to be speaking after RJ, but happy to go first. Just let me take one step back and say that for every country on the planet, I think the combination of energy security and affordable energy are sort of two priorities that almost go before anything else, and hence when you look at the energy mix that you try to achieve as a country, you want to do that going forward while maintaining the security of your supply. And if I look at my own country, we had an extreme shock in terms of energy supply 50 years ago during a former energy crisis, where we suddenly were left without any energy sources because we were dependent on the import of fossil energies. And we embarked on at that time, everything all at once strategy, which was both developing the extraction of oil and gas in the North Sea, developing very strict regulation on energy efficiency, but then also investing in the development of, at that time, non-existing renewable energy technologies with the main focus on wind. And the wind part then developed into the offshore wind, and the first offshore wind farm in the world that was set up in Danish waters in 1991. But that trajectory then came with government investments, with subsidies, and the development of the industry, but also the engineering skills of how to do it. So working with our universities and academia in developing the knowledge base and with the institutional investors in Denmark in terms of the financing. So also in a public-private collaboration of developing the skills, the technologies, the innovation, and the cost structure. And I think sort of maturing that fast forward has led us to a situation where 25 years ago, 90% of our energy was from coal, to today, where 60 to 70% is from wind and some solar and biomass. But we expect to close our last coal-fired power plant in 5 years, and we were the largest oil and gas producer in the European Union after Brexit, but have now also decided to actually end our oil and gas production by 2050, the latest, and we've no longer have government licensing grounds for oil and gas because the offshore wind is developing so fast now at such low price that where we were subsidizing it for a long time, it is so mature now that we actually have companies paying us to get the rights to develop the offshore wind grounds. The highest cost of offshore wind now is actually the transmission lines and the grid. It's not the building of the towers themselves. And I think as India matures its experience, you will also see that the first gigawatt of offshore wind will be expensive and will have to come with some kind of government support. But as you build the next gigawatts, your industry fast learns, you will develop the infrastructure, the grid, and the prices will come down extremely fast. And then offshore wind is a way to go to industrial scale energy production quite fast at such a size. I mean, the largest turbines now are 15 to 16 megawatt a piece. And that allows you to actually build very large scale, very fast. Our own national plan is to quintuple our offshore wind by 2030 to 2035, including starting to build artificial islands in the North Sea with 10 gigawatt of offshore wind around each island, and the capacity to produce the green hydrogen at sea and load it directly onto ships, and with one transmission line from a 10 gigawatt farm. That also brings down the cost. So I think we keep on innovating and maturing both the technology, the turbines, the grid, and the thinking around it in order to stay afloat, and with the close partnership with the institutional investors and the private sector. And I see India maturing very fast in that direction, and at least in our knowledge, other Asian countries are also thinking of how to build those clusters where you can innovate, mature, and have the skills base at the same time.
No, absolutely, and I think there's a lot that the world can learn from the way Denmark has gone ahead, and I think this new concept of developing these artificial islands that aggregates the supply so that there's the expenditure on the transmission gets reduced to some extent. I think that's clearly a very strong emerging trend in terms of how the offshore wind will grow in the world.
But if I may go, just one more comment that we have a target of emissions reduction of 70% by 2030, and in order to get there, we are again putting everything all at once policy in place, because we are also doing carbon capture and storage. We have a first test site where we are putting CO2 into the ground in the North Sea, and we're also investing in direct air capture, because we think we have to work on all technologies at the same time. Some will be faster in maturing. They all need some kind of government investment and subsidy up front, but in order for us to get to net zero well, our target is now 2045, we have no time to waste.
And I couldn't agree more, really. I think that's pretty much a thought that troubles a lot of us who are in the energy sector. So let me turn to Dr. Ajay Mathur, who's the Director General of the International Solar Alliance, and he was earlier also the DG at TERI. To ask you, Dr. Mathur, that we've been talking about a lot about what's happening in India, and also we heard from Mr. Christensen about Denmark and how it's become a really large market for offshore wind. But you have amongst your members a lot of countries that are very small markets. And when you're looking at the discussions where you are playing a very important part is on local supply chains. How do you really see this growing? Because are there some kind of aggregations that are happening around regional, configurations coming together to create that kind of a larger demand, or there are some other trends that you would like to get your insights out for us?
Thank you very much. One of the things that we are seeing is that the price of developing solar panels is declining. That's number one. But the vast amount of solar panels are coming out of one country. I think 86% of panels come out of China. And last year, and continuing now, there is a supply constraint in terms of logistics. So there were, for example, 2 months worth of solar panels which were on the ports in Shanghai last month, and there was an equal number of days when there was no solar panels available in West Africa, for example. As we are looking to huge increases, we are looking to 3 to 10 times, I think the IRENA numbers are, for increases in solar panel demand by 2030. This means a huge amount of new capacity needs to be developed. This obviously cannot be held to be dependent on the supply chains. This means a large amount of geographical diversification is needed. Now, as you very rightly said, there is a sort of a diversification and a sort of aggregation that is happening. Diversification, because solar panels you can make almost anywhere. If there is a demand, if there is a port where you can import cells, which are then put together in the form of panels, that makes great sense. It can happen anywhere. However, making cells is a challenge. It needs a huge infrastructure. The price of cells is here. If you make a new plant, the price is somewhere here, much more. Therefore, you need incentives. In India, we are providing the incentives on the after the sales based on efficiency, the production-linked incentive program. In the US, you're providing it through the Inflation Reduction Act, which is on the supply side. But the point of both of them is that there is a public support for the creation of new manufacturing capacity. This implies we need to look at various countries and see where these make greatest sense in terms of the macroeconomics of the country, so that local hubs can be formed around which the demand is aggregated. This leads to a separate question, which is what happens when you are looking on the one hand at manufacturing, on the other hand at technology development, and the countries which are at different levels of demand. So, for example, countries where demand is just picking up, we need what we just talked of in the form of viability gap funding. You need public sector money in order to have the confidence of the private sector that they can go ahead. As this develops, then the next question is, okay, you use something like the RPO, the Renewables Portfolio Obligation in India, which gives a degree of confidence to a person who's putting in his or her own equity that there will be a purchase, you will be paid. This leads to the third steps where, we talked a great deal about the fact that even though there is a large amount of money coming into India, it's expensive money. Why? The main reason is that the risk associated with repayments is relatively high. And therefore, all these would help if that loans, for example, provided by the ADBs, provided by the World Banks, if they can be to whatever extent converted to guarantees, because what guarantees does is it greatly leverages private sector investment. A lot more private sector investment occurs because there is this guarantee behind, and it enhances the credit enhancement that we were talking about. All of these are the blended finance that Mr. Roche talked about. But the nature of the public sector financing changes as you go along the progress in technology development. The long and the short of it is, while blended finance is clearly the answer, how you structure it depends on what the needs are, what the internal resources are. And I know that this is a long question, but I hope that this leads to a stimulation of thinking on what are the best measures in every geography. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think, this is pretty much what the next panel will also address, but I think we have time for a couple of questions from the audience. I think you've heard from professors in IIT, you've heard from the private sector, and also panelists with very significant international experience. So if there are a couple of questions that you'd like the panelists to take. Okay, I do see a hand there.
Thank you. The panel was really insightful. My question is primarily centered around the off-taker risks that were mentioned during the discussion. So maybe in the case of something like hydrogen or its derivatives, even green steel was mentioned, the producer could be in a different nation and the product could end up in another nation. So how does financing now address the risk where your off-taker is in a different geography, whereas your producer is in a different geography? So what kind of mechanism sort of could be developed here which ensures that you have cross-border trade of goods, and then the financing might be required only on one end? Yeah, thank you for that.
Any of our panelists who would like to take this on?
Very, very quickly, at the end of the day, the investor is looking at the contracts you have with the off-takers. If you have, for example, a contract with somebody across the border, then there are two risks. One is obviously the payment guarantee, and the other is the transportation risk. So in the case of green hydrogen, we are trying to reduce the transportation risk by transporting ammonia or urea or some derivative based on green hydrogen. The second option could also be that you are only exporting a part of your production. And a part of the production is what you're providing to local consumers of hydrogen in the refinery sector, in the fertilizer sector, hopefully in the steel sector tomorrow. It is this diversification of demand which would lead to an acceptable risk profile on which investors would be willing to invest.
May I just, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, just a follow-up comment maybe, and I'm not answering your questions by any means. It's a brilliant question, and it also not just goes to the financing sector, but also the policy-making sector. Because one of the biggest questions that the American taxpayer is asking today is, why should we be producing blue or green ammonia and hydrogen to decarbonize targets of South Korea and Japan, where the first generation incentives are for offtake, right? And that kind of goes back to the coordinated discussion on the global level around the source and the sink of carbon and carbon credits and all those things come into play. So there are new mechanisms that are being discussed and that need to come into play, but they all need to be working together. Working in isolation is not going to help.
Thomas?
Well, just to say that we are right now in the middle of the global transition of supply, demand, governments, private sector, we are all in this together, but we're also at various stages of moving along that curve, and hence it is a bit messy at this stage. And one of the questions that is being discussed in the next room amongst G20 energy principles is a question whether we need to have a process of standardization of green hydrogen. What is green hydrogen actually? And at least the Danish private sector, and I'm sure the same is for the Indian, are all asking us, so what is the global standard? How do we actually measure it? And if I take the industry that is biggest in my country in this question, it's the shipping industry, where some of the Danish shippers are amongst the largest in the world and are already moving ahead in procuring ships able to sail on green ammonia or green methanol. But in the absence of a global standard, they have to define the standard themselves. Their investors, their customers are saying, we will pay a premium for you transporting our good from Asia to your markets in Europe and the US. But there is no standard on what a green shipment looks like. So they have to set that themselves and procure the fuel source according to a standard that they define. And it's all a bit shaky and murky, but that is the conditions under which they have to operate. So I think as those investments grow, the demand on policymakers for actually setting some global standards and having some global common rules in this space will get bigger.
No, I think I've just got an indication that we now need to move to the next panel. But, you know, I think, Thomas, just picking up from your point of the fact that it is messy, but then which transition is not? So I think we all need to be shaken out of our comfort zone to be able to move and to be able to think out of the box, to look at policies that we hadn't really thought of, to look at problems that come up with people questioning which way we are going and how soon or how fast we can get there. So fine, I think we're in that kind of a flux, but that's what will actually get us all moving to a much more a steadier pace of deploying more renewables and getting into the energy transition with new energy, green energy of the future that we all want to see. So thank you so much, and thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for the audience for listening to this very interesting panel. Thank you.
Thank you. May I now request Ms. Gauri Singh to kindly felicitate our panelists by presenting a memento as a token of our appreciation. I now request the IRIDA team to kindly present a memento to Ms. Gauri Singh. A huge round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. We now end with the first panel discussion. Thank you. We now move on to the second panel discussion on the topic, the role of international financial institutions and multilateral development banks in mobilizing investments. This session will highlight the role played by the public sector as a catalyzer in setting the right ecosystem to reduce the cost of capital and attract private investment for the adoption of emerging energy technologies. May I request the panelists for the second session to please come up on the dais. Ms. Harsha Bangari, Mr. Pradeep Kumar Das, Mr. Soumik Lal, Mr. Pradeep Tharakan, Mr. K. Mukundan, and Mr. Ravinder Singh Dhillon. This session will be moderated by Mr. Dan Dorner, Head of the Strategic Initiatives Office at International Energy Agency. May I request the panelists to please come up on the dais? I now invite Mr. Dan Dorner for his brief presentation, followed by the panel discussion. Over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. If we could get my slides up on the screen, that would be great. Perfect. So look, welcome everyone to this second panel as part of this overall event on low-cost finance for new and emerging energy technologies. So before moving into discussions with our distinguished panel, let me start with a few framing remarks. So over the last year or so, there have been several strong signs that the clean energy economy is emerging much faster than many people thought possible. Global renewable power capacity additions surged by almost 1/4 in 2022, and this was driven by a 40% increase in solar PV, which has actually been fast enough to align with the rate envisaged in the IEA's pathway to net zero emissions by 2050, so encouraging news. Heat pumps have been growing very strongly and are outselling gas furnaces and boilers in the United States and in parts of Europe. And continued growth at this rate would almost double their share of heating in buildings worldwide by 2030. Again, encouraging news. And electric car sales increased by 55% in 2022 to over 10 million units. They now account for some 15% of the global car market, up from less than 5% just 2 years ago. Again, encouraging news, but there is a caveat with this one, which is the overwhelming majority of these sales to date are concentrated in just 3 markets: China, Europe, and the United States. And again, for more encouraging news, global energy efficiency improved at twice the rate last year of the previous 2 years. All of this is very positive news and is unsurprisingly reflected in global figures for clean energy investment. And by the end of 2022, governments had allocated an additional $1.2 trillion to sustainable transitions. Now, looking forward, government actions that we can already see will help propel clean energy investment to new highs of more than $2 trillion a year by the end of this decade. Strong growth, but to move onto a pathway consistent with a 1.5-degree scenario trajectory, we need to actually see that level of clean energy investment, infrastructure investment, to be more than $4 trillion by 2030, so around double the level that we currently expect to see. And this increase in investment is required across all sectors, from the power sector to transport, investments in efficiency, and beyond. So Another note to say is even though we see the growth in this investment story, this recent growth in global clean energy investment is actually due almost entirely to growth that we see in advanced economies and in China. And meanwhile, clean energy spending actually in many other emerging and developing economies remains relatively flat, and even for many of those countries at a level that we also saw way back in 2015. And this should be a wake-up call and an alarm bell for all of us. Many of these countries find themselves in a trap with underdeveloped financial markets deterring investment and a lack of projects preventing the establishment of reliable pricing benchmarks. And in addition to needing to ramp up the scale of investment, IEA analysis has shown that the cost of capital for a utility-scale solar PV plant in 2021 was anywhere between 2 and 3 times higher in key emerging economies than it was in advanced economies. And our cost of capital observatory shows that despite having 2/3 of the global population, emerging and developing economies, excluding China, I should say, account for less than 1/5 of the global investment in clean energy, far from proportional. Bringing down the cost of capital would make a huge difference to the overall cost of energy transitions. And again, according to our estimates, we've done some analysis, reducing those financing costs by 2 percentage points would bring the investment needed to reach net zero emissions in emerging and developing economies down by a cumulative value of $16 trillion over the period to 2050. So we need more investment, and we need to de-risk the projects, and we need to cut the cost of capital for those projects. There are renewed calls to do exactly that, including through the IFIs and MDBs. I suppose a question that we may well come to in this panel is, can we see this year as a breakthrough year? And how might India's G20 presidency help support that positive breakthrough? So with that, now let's move into the panel discussion. I have several questions that I'd like to put to our distinguished speakers, and we're all very keen to hear their responses. But let me start by posing a question in turn to the Managing Director of India's Exim Bank, Managing Director Harsha Bangari, and also to a representative from NIIF, Mr. K. Mukundan. The question really is, looking at your experience, Managing Director, what do you think have been some of the key barriers and risks that come in the way of unlocking clean energy investments in emerging market economies? And what kind of de-risking approaches do you think might work to help overcome those? Over to you.
So if your permission, I can start. Thank you, Mr. Donner. And good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you so much, MNRE, Ireda, and Irina. Coming straight to answer your questions, I thought I'll just put 1 or 2 statistics which will support the presentation you have made. One is that yes, India is the 3rd largest energy consumer country. So, you know, if India doesn't move in tandem with what are the plans, I think we need to really look at it. Secondly, when we look at the cost of capital, and this is some analysis we have done, and maybe you can correct me, but in emerging markets, the cost of funding a renewable project is almost 7 times the cost of capital in the developed countries, you know. Maybe because of emerging markets, the risks perceived are larger, but that's the gap we are looking at filling in. Now, coming to the barriers or constraints, I'm talking as a financial institution, so my arguments will be very, very financial. Please bear with me. I can just quickly divide the constraints in a couple of segments. And the first one, I think many of my predecessor speakers, the earlier session also spoke about this, is the technology support. Now, you will agree with me that the return profile on renewable energy or climate projects is not that attractive, and there are risks associated with that, which naturally demands a higher premium. Now, this typically happens because the technology cost is very high, and because of that, the capital outlay which is required to set up a renewable or a clean power project is higher to that extent. We have seen similar incidences in the past. We were talking about solar projects and wind projects, and as a country, we have had immense success on the solar side. Like, I'm just trying to go back into numbers to 2010, 2011. The cost of setting up a solar power plant, and if we compare it with today, it's almost 88% lower. So that is a level of cost reduction which has happened on a clean power project because of technology advancement. So that is something which I think is there in our face and something which we need to address. Secondly, also, I'm sorry to say, but climate finance typically is seen as a straight-jacketed, which solely depends on the use of funds. Now, when we say use of funds, the typical targets for such financing would be zero carbon emission type of projects. But in India, if you look, or even in the other emerging markets you look, there is a lot of focus, or there's a need to focus on the what we call as transition financing, where we could also look at sectors which contribute to carbon emissions, and whether there is some way of financing that under transition financing. Just to give you an idea, in India, the sovereign green bond setup, or the framework which was set up by the government of India, includes transition financing is one of the ways in which these bonds can be used. Also, earlier there was a mention, I was listening very keenly to the earlier presentation. So, we talk about nascent technology. So how do we, as financial system, support the ecosystem which contribute to development of climate projects or green projects or renewable projects, how we call them. And there, in fact, our bank and many banks have programs where we support nascent technologies, and we term it under transition finance. Now, how do we de-risk it? De-risking, I don't know, again, 2-3 ways. We can talk about policy de-risking. We can talk about financial de-risking. Coming to policy de-risking, I think lots of efforts have been made, and it is sort of reaping benefits. We are looking at government stepping in and promoting renewable projects in the country. We are also seeing the regulator. There have been instances of lots of green bond issuances from the country. But the regulator, that is the Reserve Bank of India, they also come up with a working paper on green deposits, because most of the commercial banks' source of funds are deposits. And there is a dialogue where, the normal people like us can actually deposit our money with the banks and tell the banks to use that money only for climate change or green finance type of activities. Also, in terms of the costing difference, so what is the, how do you fill that gap? It could be part of viability gap funding. It could be also lots of discussion. One thing we have to understand is that public finance can never be enough to finance this sector. And there is a real need for private sector to step in. And the private sector typically will only step in when they are comfortable with the risk profiling of these projects, the returns expected. We're talking about blending finance and taking different structures. For example, at Exim Bank, when we support clean technologies, we also look at financing by way of equity investments rather than doing it in a debt format. Similarly, the role of AIFIs and MDB cannot be under stressed. They play a very pivotal role, and the idea is to maybe blend private sector financing with public sector, because typically in a private sector financing, the tenors are seen very carefully. And most of the projects we are looking at finance today are requiring funds for say 15 to 20 years or even over that, which typically makes the cost of these projects very high. So in some sort of blending where, you know, the first loss policy, or earlier Mr. Mathur was mentioning about guarantees or credit enhancement models, which will enable capital to get garnered, you know. As Exim Bank, we also look at doing renewable power projects in our partner countries. So just to give you some idea, we have financed over 28 projects overseas in Asia, Africa, and Latin America with a commitment of over $2 billion. There, as India, we also look at transferring technology. So, you know, while we provide credit lines and enable these countries to set up these projects, we also localize the technology there. So I think it's going to be a mix, a blend of private sector, public sector, a commercial bank or a financial bank along with, and also the structure in terms of equity, debt, or other type of structuring. Thanks.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Managing Director. And I really appreciated the fact you got us off to a good start. You had lots of concrete numbers there and real practical actions. But let me turn the same question over to you, Mr. Mukundan. So think about key barriers and risks, and also potentially key de-risking approaches that you think may be practical.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, MNRE, for having me on this panel. I will talk about the risks, the challenges which we have, but before that, let it not convey a message that NIF is too risk-averse for the renewable energy sector itself. And I would like to give you certain statistics about what we have done so far. We are present across many segments of this renewable energy sector itself. We are at the grid level as both as equity investors and as debt providers. Firstly, as debt providers, we have set up an NBFC, which today has a loan book of about 35,000 crores. Of which 60–70% I would say is on renewable energy projects. And the portfolio is doing very well for us. So we have a large presence in our debt platforms. On our equity platform side, we have about 4 gigawatts of solar and onshore wind. We also have something on the electric mobility. We have an equity investment into an electric mobility, which is largest bus operator today in the country. We are present in the circular economy as well, where we have set up Asia's probably the largest waste to gas production plant, which has become operational last year. So we are present in the entire value chain of the renewable and the green economy. So just to set the context to say that the risks which I'm going to talk about now doesn't convey other message otherwise. Coming to, based on our own experience of as a developer in developing bidding for several of these and as a financier as well, what we see is that basically this entire power sector is on the concurrent list of this country. In this country, there are certain laws which are governed by the central government, and there are something which are governed by the state government, and power is essentially which is concurrent to both the governments. And which leads to, and the biggest consumers of power are the state electricity boards, the state discoms, which are governed essentially by the state governments. And at times we have seen issues about interpretation of laws by the state regulatory commissions, by the state governments. So many of the state discoms are not in the best of the financial health, which creates some kind of challenges for us as developers to finance projects at the state level. How we as a country, I mean, this is a larger issue for many of the developers, but we as a country have overcome it, I would say, over the last 6 or 7 years. There is this organization called the Solar Energy Corporation of India, whose initial mandate was slightly different, and then now it has become a kind of an intermediary between solar developers and the consumer, which is the weak state electricity boards. The change of this mandate, which happened about 6 or 7 years back, really gave a fillip to the entire industry, and which has resulted in a lot of international capital coming into this entire industry. So while the challenges of country like India are very unique, if you take other emerging economies, take for example South Africa, take for example Taiwan, these are some of the issues which are not there because there is a central government equivalent there which procures all the electricity, so you are essentially taking the sovereign risk. You are taking risk on the state governments which have probably not the best of the payment track records. And we have found solutions for that as well. We as a country have found solutions. So if this kind of a however, that was the challenge. We have found a solution for that as well. The second challenge which we again find is there are change of laws which happen about domestic panel procurement and stuff like that, and which has affected implementation of several of solar energy projects in the last 1 or 2 years. But again, the learning from those experiences for us is that a constant engagement with our ministry, which is the MNRE, which has been extremely supportive for us in representing for us. As a nation, we have certain ambitions of domestic manufacturing. A lot of panel comes from China, 86% is what I heard in the last panel. And therefore, we as a country wanted to de-risk. We have an ambition of having our own domestic manufacturing, and therefore there are different interest groups which ask for domestic manufacturing. Therefore, how do we address these kind of challenges which come through as we bid for projects and we have won certain projects, and how do we implement it? We work with the relevant ministries, and now they are extremely open to suggestions, and we have seen issues getting resolved. Therefore, instead of, while documents are there, the contract structures are there, an active engagement with your own line ministry, with your SECI, and with the state governments is what helps us to resolve many of these issues. The third issue which we have seen is on the implementation side. We have had challenges at times in land procurement. We have had challenges on evacuation, especially transmission, because we are dependent on other third parties like state government entities, the CTUs and other things. And therefore, at times we have stayed away from certain biddings because we feel that the execution of the transmission line may not be to the expectation of what it could be, which could lead to problems at a later point of time. So these are my large challenges, but the way we have overcome that as well.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. I think it was particularly useful to understand how NIF has had experience in so many different parts of this whole challenge, but also then highlighting from that experience financial robustness of all of the players in the deals, change of law risk, and also transmission, again, making sure that you feel real confidence there. So very good points. Let me move on to get on a perspective from a regional development bank now. So be good to hear from Mr. Pradeep Tharakan, Director of Energy Transition of the Asian Development Bank. So let me pose a new question to you, sir, if I may. So from your perspective, what approaches and instruments do you see that you think can enhance private sector participation, in particular in clean energy projects? Over to you.
Thank you, Dan. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the government for having ADB at this event. Just to put things in perspective, since we've been sharing statistics, all multilateral development banks and regional development banks together account for about 300 to 350 billion of lending every year. It is a very small amount of money compared to what the world needs. And as mentioned before, the public sector cannot do it all. Now, direct lending from the MDBs is quite limited. Now, we can do a few creative things in terms of using our balance sheet, and we are trying to do that. There was a mention earlier today of our ADBs just launched the innovative facility for climate action in the Asia Pacific, which is really leveraging our balance sheet and risk transferring some of it so that we can free up headroom to do more lending. But that's going to give us, a few tens of billions. Not anything close to what we're being told here today. So I think where we can really bring value and help to bring the private sector in is through really using our expertise, using our leveraging ability. And if I were to sort of divide them into three main categories or strategies, one is, it's been mentioned before, helping to create bankable projects and de-risking them. The second is MDBs can help address government failures. And the third is really addressing market failures, which prevents private sector from coming in. And I'll just give you some quick use cases. They've all been mentioned in different ways by the speakers all through the day. So I'll just give you a few use cases of how ADB is doing this and applications for the region and for G20 countries in general. So let me give you an example of Cambodia, right? A very small country, about 2.5 gigawatts of peak demand, not investment grade, no solar generation plants, heavily reliant on hydro and coal. So ADB got involved in the country and we said, let's help you set up the first solar park. So we borrowed the idea from India. We saw all the cost reductions that are coming. We showed them the numbers and we said, you can do this. You have a fantastic solar resource. Why don't we help you with the first solar park? And what we did was we brought end-to-end support. So it's not just about preparing a project, it's about really providing the whole of project cycle support. And this is where an MDB can come in. So we've got a public arm, we've got a private arm, and we've got PPP transaction advisory. So all parts of ADB came together. We sat down with the government, we did the studies, did the bankable assessments, we helped the utility to buy the land, and then we financed the evacuation infrastructure, so the substations and the power lines, and then we helped the utility to tender out the 100 megawatt solar park in 2 phases. The first phase, over 130 firms came to Cambodia and they bought the bid docs. 22 bids came in, 3.9 cents per kilowatt hour. This was the awarded tariff. At the same time, countries in the region, such as Vietnam, were issuing tariffs at 7.5 cents. Much more investment-friendly countries, such as Malaysia, were issuing tariffs and PPAs at 6 cents. This was the first solar reverse auction in the ASEAN. So great results. And then the second phase was during COVID, and we were really concerned. We said, what's going to happen? We might not get enough bids. We had 15 firms bid, 2.9 cents, record price again. So this really showed us that when you have an MDB in the mix, helping the client to prepare a project, de-risking it, we had stapled financing on the private side, we had sovereign financing, we had transaction advisory, the PPAs were best, represented best international practice, we've got transparent procedures, and of course, all kudos to the government that we had champions there who are willing to take this experiment forward and take the risk. And then, we've talked about policy de-risking. At the same time, we're also helping the government to put in place a new power development plan looking ahead for the next 20 years. And then the government essentially worked with us to announce a 2 gigawatt solar plus energy storage program. So the private sector not only sees the 100 megawatt, they also see the 2 gigawatts coming down the line. So all of this led to a massive reduction in price. So you can combine this now with it's not just about projects, but you also need staple financing. So green financing facilities, and we've done this in China, in the province of Shandong, where we set up a green financing facility, which is leveraged 1:10 times in terms of private sector investment. A couple of other ways, and when it comes to government failures, SECI has been mentioned. It's a fantastic example. You don't even need MDBs. Domestic financial institutions and governments can set up structures that can, provide sort of payment risk guarantees with the tripartite agreement between RBI, the government, SECI, and the SEBs. And so we could replicate this, and MDBs can come in and support some of these structures in other countries as well. Indonesia, the Indonesia Infrastructure Guarantee Facility does similar things. It basically guarantees, essentially payment risk on PPP contracts. So that was something that the MDBs were very much behind. So another example of how we can do this. And finally, on market risk, I think one of the things that we often struggle is with large institutional investors, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, insurance companies. They are not well suited to invest in the infrastructure sector because they need long-term standardized instruments indexed to inflation. They'd like, regular cash flows, investment-grade instruments, which are often not well aligned with sort of infrastructure projects, especially in the early stages. So the key question that we are struggling with is how do we translate and create, essentially bank loans and other sorts of instruments and collateralize them or securitize them in a way that can be made interesting. So one of the things that we did is if you look at the renewable energy financing landscape in India, most of it has been financed by commercial loans. It's only last year that project bonds were actually the first time that they actually superseded commercial bank loans. Now, not everybody can raise project bonds in India. It's, of course, the tier 1 developers can do that, but how do you credit enhance the tier 2 and the tier 3 developers to do that, especially when you look at smaller projects like the Kusum C agriculture projects, which are much smaller, right? So what ADB did is we essentially set up a credit enhancement for project bonds facility with IIFCL. So that was something that we did about 6 years ago, and we managed to exit that, and IIFCL has gone on to do its own credit enhancement, and now we're replicating that in Bangladesh as well. So that's another example. And finally, because transition finance came up, just wanted to mention an interesting experiment that we are embarking on right now, is that while we talk about renewables, everybody loves renewables, we have a problem with our existing fossil assets. These are long-lived. A lot of them operate under power purchase agreements. in some ways, they're quite nice projects in the sense that you have regular cash flows 20 years ahead. So can we now find ways to essentially re-leverage and refinance these contracts and these assets and use concessional money such that we can preliminarily terminate these PPAs? So you accelerate the closure and the eventual phase out of these power plants. So ADB's energy transition mechanism is something that we're working on to try and see, especially we can take some of these PPAs and loans and bring them under a single fund or a platform where we can bring in MDB money alongside with bilateral money, concessional money from philanthropies, and commercial money to find ways to re-leverage and refinance these projects as a way of supporting transition finance. So let me stop here. Thanks.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And can I ask you a quick follow-up? Because there was a couple of points there that caught my attention. But one that caught my attention was you were saying, look, if the MDBs can be involved from end to end, that can have quite a transformational effect in terms of bringing the overall cost down. But that's potentially quite resource intensive. But then what that sparks in my mind is a broader question of, are there any bottlenecks or capacity constraints within MDBs at the moment in terms of the scale of transition that we're looking to achieve? You've already talked about the overall scale of finance that is available, which obviously can only go so far. Are MDBs are they too risk averse in terms of being able to take on riskier projects? Or if you do take on this end-to-end model, do you just have human capacity constraints? So there are only so many projects you can actually deliver that gold standard service for?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I mentioned IIFCL. In fact, that project, the project evaluation showed that we spent way too much staff time on it. It is a success. IIFCL then went on to do its own credit enhancement, but it did cost a huge amount of money in terms of staff resources. So that's a really good question, and I think that's why it makes sense to start really partnering with DFIs, domestic financial institutions in the countries. I mean, especially in India, you've got gold standard institutions like PFC and REC and IREDA, which is now more than capable of doing these things. So we have to pass the baton and work in partnership initially and then step out of the way and let these institutions go forward. So perhaps that's one way. The other is, Dan, silos exist in every organization. I mean, I told you about this example of public, private, and PPPs working together. We try to replicate it as much as we can, but it's not always easy. Just really briefly, ADB is going through a massive reorganization, and what we're trying to do is exactly break down these silos and bring what we're calling the new organizational model, where we want to work across areas and work, bring the public and the private, all of them together to the client and say, what is the problem you have? What is the solution you need? And let's put all of our tools to work rather than sort of sending you one way or the other. So,
very good, very good. Yeah, and the silo issue certainly does ring bells from my experience. Let me turn now to actually the Power Finance Corporation, if I may. So PFC being the largest financier in the energy sector, what role do you play in India's energy transition? But also putting that into the broader context, what do you think would be the funding requirement to achieve the goal of net zero by 2070, and where and how do we get the MDBs and the IFIs to play their role in helping India achieve its 2070 goal?
Thank you very much for having me here. The requirement of funding, which was indicated all over the world, I think 150 trillion US dollars are required, and out of that, around 10 to 20 is the estimation trillion dollars are required for energy transition in India. So that is a lot of money which is required. And what has been estimated is around 60% of that will be available from the domestic markets, and the remaining has to be mobilized through international funding. So around 4 trillion US dollars will be required for funding the energy transition from outside the country. And there are different options which are available. One is the bond market, international bond market is there, and then green funds are there, and then the multilateral developmental banks have to pitch in. So the demand is going to be there, and the renewable energy requirement is going to increase as we see the demand for the country itself. PFC has been funding power projects in generation, transmission, distribution, and we have funded number of renewable energies, and this is our thrust area. We have funded around 25 gigawatts of renewable energy, dispersing about 7.5 billion US dollars to these funds, to these projects. So the requirement is going to be there, and with renewables coming in a big way, we need, being intermittent in nature, we need some balancing power. So energy storage is the requirement. And while we are talking about battery storage, I think there is a need for pump storage schemes also. And within the country, we have around potential of 120 gigawatts of pump storage schemes. And the government of India has indicated during the next 5 to 10 years, around 10 to 20 gigawatts will be developed. So this is the area which we have to look at for balancing power. I think these are the requirements which is for the country, and this can be pitched in by the multilateral development finance institutions.
Brilliant, wonderful. Thank you so much. I don't know if this is true for some of the other people in the room, but I tend to find when we talk in trillions, I kind of struggle to get my head around the scale of it. And I'm a finance ministry official by a deep background, so if anything, these big numbers shouldn't be quite so scary to me. But what I then try and translate it to in my own mind is the scale of the opportunity. You know, thinking about the growth of industries, you know, going from very small to very large very quickly, and the scale of the opportunities that means for hundreds and thousands of businesses, and needing to get the finance to then marry up to make that happen. So with that, actually, I might turn to the Indian Renewable Energy Development Agency, if I may. How can the pipeline of bankable clean energy projects be scaled up to those kinds of quantums, to those kind of numbers? You know, what are some of the things that financial institutions can look to do and look for in projects to try and help make sure that they improve, get better, become more bankable, and we see the numbers we need to see? Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, and for getting me opportunity to be in the panel. So, being one of the partner for this program, so already in my introductory inauguration program, I have already said that IREDA is the largest lender of RE. And we're talking about support of developmental agency, then we're talking about making bankability. So risk is the only thing which will make it bankable and not bankable. Nobody can tell that risk will not be there. Risk we have to eliminate. If we cannot, we have to mitigate. If we cannot, then we have to manage and control. That is the way we can make it bankable. See, IREDA is there since 36 years. If you see, in 33 years, the number of volume of business what IREDA did, in 3 years did the same size of business. And these 3 years includes 2 years of peak COVID. So which is confirming that when opportunity is there, if you have an approach and your intent is clear and you partner with your stakeholders, not borrowers, we call them stakeholders, then only you can achieve this. First of all, you have to go for reducing or eliminating the asymmetry in information. As a lender and borrower, first object and approach to be that be honest in your intent and clear on your projects and whatever you want. That is the practice we have followed in last 3 years. In 3 years, 12 quarters, 13 meetings we have done with the stakeholders to understand what is the sectoral issues, what is the individual developer issues. And we have addressed, I think, 100% of their concern. And we talk about interest cost, we talk about support of global developmental funds. In 3 years, we have not done any foreign line of credits. That means our domestic market is mature, our governance mechanism is quite qualitative. We could manage from the entire funding in last 3 years from the domestic sources. Top of it, 3 years, we went on continuously reducing the interest rate directly or through rebates so that the projects become bankable. Whatever is the savings we could generate from our borrowing, we passed on to the sector development. See, in the process of reduction of rates, I joined the company 3 years back, and 3 years continuously we reduced. Those who have seen me 3 years before, they find me, I have reduced my age also. And many of our developers are here, and I can announce from this platform, I'll give you 10 pips reduction if you contradict with me what I'm saying. See, that should be the approach. And we had 92 NPA accounts. We have settled around 35 NPA accounts. We have not compromised on the principal. We have not compromised on the interest. Wherever it is genuine and doable, we have sacrificed only our profit. That is what true sense of developing the sector is. I'm quite confident the kind of size of business what we are having, and this is coming guaranteed by none other than our Honorable Prime Minister, who is so passionate about this 500 gigawatt. And look at the government policies. Why only India? If you see the global context also. Remember in March first week what happened? 2 banks in US and 1 bank in Europe. Then immediately the 2 governments, they pitched in, they could save it. That means if something quite abnormal, force majeure kind of things is there, government is there to support. And Government of India is hand-holding the sector like anything. And the agencies of Government of India, IREDA, REC, PFC, of course REC, PFC, they are having quite a less percentage in their loan book size, 3 to 5% in renewable. But initially they were developing the electric sector and IREDA was developing renewable energy. Now both have to, 3 organizations have to work together because IREDA's balance sheet size is small, though we have doubled in every front in last 3 years, but the kind of quantum of fund requirement is there. These 3 organizations can complement each other and work together to take the synergy out of it. And I'm confident those what is not bankable, we can make it bankable. The moment you become transparent and handhold the developer, because RE and non-REs both are quite different. RE's project construction period is pretty small, and most of the components in the project are import-centric. So your commitment to your suppliers, you have to honor. So as a lender, if you keep your commitment and understand the timely disbursal of the funds to them, that will ease out the 50% of the problem. Second, short duration, if you give timely, there will be no interest during construction, unlike fossil fuel or nuclear power. Decades, the project takes time, and the IDC becomes sizable amount. Here, we don't have that. And post-construction period, incidentally, this kind of thing in our banking or non-banking space, people are not recognizing that. Post-COD, the risk amount goes down drastically. Then your interest also should go down drastically. And in IREDA, the secret is that in 3 years that we have done, we made quite a lot of difference between pre-COD project and post-COD project. On a one, we have passed on the rebate. No need to wait for the borrower. Then we are living in an era of digital economy. Probably we are the first banking organization, non-banking banking organization, who could sanction project loan without the borrower physically visiting to the office. So that means we have ease of doing business in place, and we understand the developer's concern well also. And we have given some 7-8 loans like that. Out of 7-8 loans, almost 6 are new startups. If my old borrower, A-rated borrower not coming, we can do. but somebody new startup, and they are successful today. And they are in new emerging ethanol, bioenergy space, small size. So we need, and IREDA is having a full range of products. And since renewables execution, as I said, project time period is less, maybe 1.5 to 3 years, some of our developers desired that we want a true fixed cost, because I want to focus on the project. I don't want to make money out of interest, fluctuations and all. We introduce a true fixed product for them. For 3 years, they will be doing only project, nothing else. Post 3 years, they have the choice to continue or discontinue. Our logo is reflecting top line, energy forever, because renewable energy. Bottom line is, once IREDA, always IREDA. That means once our lender borrower comes to us, we'll try our 100% or more than 100% to retain them by providing qualitative services to them. And if you see the governance perspective, what we do, we're the first public sector in the history of the India who published the audited result last year in 30 days, and this year we have done 25 days. Next year we'll be doing in 15 days to match with the best private sector NBFC in India. That is confirming the best quality corporate governance in place. And we have upgraded from AA plus to AAA. And see, when we are AA plus, our borrowing is definitely 50 paisa more than the AAA. Despite that, we ensured the lowest rate prevailing in this space. See, once you have clarity in your approach and your intent will be very clear, then automatically things can become easily. Nothing much to be done, very simple thing. You need not get into that. And that misnomer of having low-cost funds from abroad, when 3 years we have not run any single fund, that confirms it is not simply low-cost funds. And my request from this platform to the MDBs and others, they also have to revisit, because this is what in established sector. But in the new and emerging, we need to again get the support from them. Because since 1990, they were with IREDA for developing these mature sectors, which were not mature then, those were at emerging that point of time. Now the similar situation, be it offshore wind, storage, e-mobility, these are all emerging and fast-changing technology. And these lenders also should have a R&D team with themselves to understand the sectoral changes happening across globe. 30 years back, it was not like that, or 20 years back, it was not like that. Today, what is happening in any corner of the world through WhatsApp or any other mechanism, you are getting to know in a second. So, information is flowing very fast. The lender need to be more alert, proactive, and decisive in their approach. And any developer, if you have, as a lender, if you have this kind of approach, any developer is ready to come forward to take the support from you, because they want to focus on developing rather than this. And there is a trend in India, if you find, most of the funds are now acquiring commissioned assets. Why? Because they don't want to take the construction risk here. So this is again an input for the Indian developers. We have the expertise for developing. And you encash your expertise that, develop it. If they're ready to acquire, you get a good value out of it. So go for it. Many of our assets we have experienced in the last couple of years, funds are acquiring the commission assets. There is a trend now, and which is indicating these foreign funds have a faith in the Indian system and in the Indian government and the governance in place by the regulator. See, if you remember the COVID time, how RBI came forward for allowing the moratorium, that means the regulator is also hand-holding and supporting. So government, regulator, financer. Then what else the developer requires? I think I'm quite confident project can become bankable easily. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. And let me just, yeah, please. Let me just also praise all the great and inspiring work that your organization is doing and pick up on 2 points, if I may. So firstly, I'm really pleased that you highlighted startups and small projects. I think that's another important angle to bring into this discussion. But let me also ask you a follow-up question on a point that you raised, and also if any other members of the panel want to come back on this one too. Explicitly or implicitly, a lot of our conversation so far has really been focused on the power sector. But as you say, we're increasingly looking not just at the power sector, but at every sector. And there will be both learning from what we've done in the power sector, and there will be unique attributes that are very different, be it in transport, be it in trying to incentivize energy efficiency, transition financing and investment was mentioned earlier. What things do you think we can learn and transfer, and what other new things do you think we need to do to make sure that this transition accelerates quickly in those other sectors?
See, when you talk about with the climate concept in mind, so energy transition and decarbonization, and it is not only the responsibility of Power Ministry or MNRE. It is now MOPNG, roads and transport, shipping, because you require energy everywhere. So, and first of all, we need to have a fair amount of awareness also. All along we are spending on developing energy, but how to use those energy efficiently? Do we really require, we know pretty well. See, today to have a 6% GDP growth in Indian economy, we are requiring 8% of growth in energy generation. But I think we can achieve if we have a fair amount of awareness on energy usage. I'm sure at least this 8% will be reduced, so that effective utilization of energy will be there. Because more the energy you generate, more carbon you are bringing, unless it is a fossil one. Even for fossil also, you are using battery. Batteries, again, having, so therefore, there will be a holistic approach. It will be each and every person's responsibility to ensure that environment and climate is in place. So, and even I'm talking of educational institutes, they also have to play a key role. Because having an en masse awareness, see, look how our COVID vaccination program became successful. Such a huge country. How it started? That time when Honorable Prime Minister started that putting the candles or beating the, so people thought of like, what is this? So it was nothing but uniting everybody and creating an awareness about the safety and protection of it. If we learn from there, similarly for energy usage, energy generation, energy transition or decarbonization, en masse awareness is required, which is missing today. And because this is the learning from recently we had an energy literacy program. That's the reason in my first morning session I told 36 local institutions we are going to have this energy literacy. So once we should have, if we are having the awareness of usage, then awareness of generation, then awareness of financing, everything. See, while settling those old NPS, what I referred, I can give you some example. Most of them used to come and ask, sir, we have taken 100 crore, we have already paid you 100 crore. But you have taken 100 times. You have paid 100 crore after 10 years. What happened? Interest cost. No, this problem was there. Then I told, look, problem was there. Had that problem not been there, you would have made 100 crore. Whether you would have come and shared with us? No. So we need to create awareness with them also. So I am confident the way government is driving and all the machineries in government, all the departments, everybody, all are working together now. And I'm confident this problem will be overcome.
Brilliant, thank you. Would any other member of our panel like to come in, please? In fact, please let me start here and then work along.
No. Just wanted to, I don't think it's totally relevant, but just wanted to add another element which makes finance in this sector viable is also the consciousness on the banking sector part in terms of the ESG. So when we talk about environment and we talk about sustainability, renewable energy, clean energy plays a very big role. You know, there are other issues, other elements also like affordable housing or water and wastewater management. But the renewable energy becomes, and what is happening increasingly, it's happening in our bank, and I'm sure it's happening everywhere, is that more and more we are setting up governance systems internally, And what we are also doing is we are trying to connect it with our due diligences. So what happens is that now we have a sustainable finance committee, which definitely will give some brownie points for project which is renewable or which is providing clean energy. And that part of due diligence gets overlaid with our credit due diligence, so that the risk scoring which we do for a particular project would become much better, because we have started looking at the benefits of that project also when we are doing. And I think that also helps us raising money. So as Exim Bank, we are actually dependent on the international capital markets, and we raise huge amounts of money. So in January 23 we did a $1 billion bond issuance, and in fact we did a sustainability bond issuance. So we've been able to map our assets because of these endeavors, and because of that endeavor we were able to raise money from marquee investors who have become very conscious about where their money goes. So I think that little bit of consciousness in terms of the lending community for sustainability or ESG also could play a bigger role in terms of directing finance to this sector.
That's brilliant.
Yeah,
Thank you
one
very
point
much.
I missed, sir. See, we do not have a well-defined green taxonomy in India as on date. See, once you have a well-defined green taxonomy in place, huge population, then when every citizen thinks, when I am putting my money into green bonds or green deposits, I am contributing an asset which is not visible, but which is going to help my grandchildren, great-grandchildren. And such a huge population, simple contribution in the form of deposit from the mass public, that can enable a huge amount of fund also. See, these are the areas which we have not looked into. And also, all these Indian lenders, including IREDA or PFC and REC, we have always looked into US, Europe and other things. Now the trend is Abu Dhabi has become quite a good location. So we should look for the newer locations which we have not explored, and there is a possibility of bringing low-cost fund from there. So ultimately, costs have to come down, and technology changes, whatever happens, it should be en masse well-aware. There will not be asymmetry of information. These two things can enable quite a lot of.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think you're already anticipating potential further questions. Would any other panelists like to come in on the question around beyond the power sector? Please, PFC.
Power sector, I think renewable energy, all forms of renewable energies are being converted into electricity, be it solar, be it wind. So power sector has a very important role to play. And the usage also, if you see that electric vehicles are being charged, and then we are talking about green hydrogen where a lot of renewable energy is required. So power sector will remain an important sector in the energy transition. And regarding these funds which are available from green financing is available, PFC has the experience of raising 300 million euros and also earlier 400 million USD. So what we have found that the green bonds which we raise, there is demand, but ultimately it is not converting into the lowering of cost. So that has to be, I think, debated, that how to reduce the cost of funding. Even going outside, we are not getting that lower cost for the green bonds. Within India also, as has been indicated, we can try different green deposits, etc., to lower the cost. So that is definitely required, and we have to basically the new transition which is going to happen, offshore wind, then green hydrogen, and these are the new areas where public financing will be required initially, and then we have to, the crowd-in private funding will be also required based on the public, so some sort of blending will also be required.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree. Thank you. I'm just going to call on Mr. McCunnan. I'm also just going to let our audience know we will have time for one or two questions from the audience. So if you do have some bright ideas, prepare yourselves now. But let me pass the floor over to you, sir.
Yeah, this is to look at the question of what were the learnings from the renewable energy sector in India and how we could adopt similar stuff to the other industries as well. There was an earlier panel where there were certain representatives of the steel industry and the question of how do we decarbonize steel industry is being debated by the Ministry of Steel, and where we are also associated. One of the important data points there is in India, we have about 6 or 7 large steel manufacturers. But the larger, who would have their own plants, who have the financial muscle to set up their own renewable energy projects and decarbonize themselves. But there is also a large community of about 5,000 small and medium industries which are in the steel sector, which are in re-rolling, melting, electric arc furnaces and stuff like that, downstream in the entire value chain, which need to decarbonize themselves. And how do we, and they don't have the financial muscle to set up their own captive power plants. They are not financially strong enough where they could enter into corporate PPAs with other renewable energy developers. And how do we address this logjam of they not being able to decarbonize themselves? Therefore, I was going back to the question of SECI, which I mentioned just now, where a central government-sponsored entity intermediated the power purchase between a weak buyer of power and an independent developer. And can similar solutions be adopted for the SMEs in the steel sector as well? Can we increase the scope of SECI or an equivalent authority where their scope is increased beyond the purchase of intermediating between the DISCOM and the developer to small and medium enterprises, how the risk management methods can be improved for them? Similarly, will also be a green hydrogen requirement for all these small and medium enterprises. Can an intermediation, a central government or a central government supported intermediation would be required for some time for these energy transition to happen for the small and medium enterprises?
Brilliant, thank you. Very good point. I'm really glad that we brought the steel sector and heavy industry into this discussion. Now let me just open it up to the floor. Are there any requests for questions from the floor? Please, you sir. 1 second, wait for the microphone. Feel free to introduce yourself.
Yeah. I'm a RE developer and a stakeholder of IRIDA for the last 28 years. I completely watch with Mr. Pradeep Kumar Das about our experience, and we have been with IRIDA for the last 28 years. So my question is about reducing the cost of capital, especially when there is a recession happening globally and the interest rates are going up abroad in the developed world. How do we keep the interest rates down or stable? And recently, the last 2 years, RBI has increased the repo rate by almost 2.5 to 3%. And fortunately, IRIDA has not increased little bit, but not that much. So my question is, how do we reduce the cost instead of holding it? Thank you.
Brilliant. And are you directing that question at any particular panelist, or would you just like anyone who would like to come?
Anyone.
Please. Would anyone like to, please?
Yeah, Ajay talked about having a green taxonomy policy in place that will enable a good amount of green bond market. Okay. So I'm confident we'll be having cheaper rates of raising from domestically. And also, as I indicated, globally, because of the geopolitical and other conditions, the uncertainty has gone up quite a lot. And as gradually the time will come, we are expecting that things will settle down, and we'll be exploring the various ways and means for reducing. As you said, 3 years you have experienced. In last 1 year, RBI has announced 250 bips repo, Fed has announced 500 bips, but we have not done that. On last 31st March only, we have gone very 0.25 kind of thing. So that is not thing. And this uncertainty in the market will be there. But how to handle those uncertainty, I think Indian economy or Indian government or Indian developers, they have quite matured experience to handle. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. PFC, please.
So has been indicated that the repo rate has increased over the time, over the last 1 year, PFC and REC have also not reduced, have not increased the interest rates. The increase in interest rates for renewables has been much lower than what is for the conventional generation. So I would like to indicate that there is a sort of cross-subsidization of where we are giving thrust to renewable energy rather than conventional generation.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Would anyone else like to come in on that? Yep, please, ADB.
Really quickly, another experiment that we've sort of started to do is when we look out for concessional sources of money, how do we bring down the cost of capital, right? So philanthropies is another area that a group of entities that we're talking to. So you've got national philanthropies, you've got international philanthropies. So over the last 2 years, ADB partnered with Goldman Sachs and the Bloomberg Foundation to put together a relatively small amount of money, $25 million of funding that was then blended in with our private sector projects. Within a year, we were able to deploy that money. We've recently signed an MOU with the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, which is supported by 3 major philanthropies. They have committed up to $100 million for primarily transition financing and energy transition type work. So we hope to be able to use that both in the public and the private sector for battery energy storage, for distribution reform, perhaps even coal to clean energy. So these are small numbers, but I think it's just to show that there is another entity that is now coming into the financing mix. Yeah. And they're very flexible. They can provide grants, they can provide 0% loans, they could provide guarantees. So we really need to sort of tap that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And often those small examples can then kind of tread the path and show the path for bigger funds to follow. Please.
No, just to add, in India, the Reserve Bank of India also has now stepped in, and they have included renewable energy projects under priority sector financing. So what happens is that cost of funds are going up, so that's a reality. But at the same time, we speak relatively because of inclusion of renewable energy in priority sector lending. Definitely, there will be that benefit which will accrue to companies who are seeking finance for renewable energy.
Very good point. I'm afraid that was such a good question and prompted so many answers that I'm now going to have to wrap it up because of our timing. So let me just close this session by thanking once again the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy for organizing this event and this session. Thank them for inviting me to chair this panel. And most importantly, thank this excellent panel for making my life so easy and keeping all of you so engaged for the last hour or so. It's been really great to share this combination of views and insights on what I know we all agree is a really critical issue, and to make sure that we can see the acceleration in clean energy transitions that we want and need to see, and recognizing how critical financing and investability and bankability is to that whole thing. I hope you found it useful, and please thank our audience, thank our panel.
Thank you, Mr. Dorner. Thank you, panelists. May I now invite Mr. Dan Dorner to felicitate our panelists by presenting a memento as a token of our appreciation. A huge round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. May I request the IRIDA team to please present a memento to Mr. Dan Dorner. May we have a group photo, please? Thank you, panelists. This brings us to the end of the second panel discussion. Very interesting and engaging discussions. May I now request Mr. Dinesh Jagdele, Joint Secretary, Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, to please deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, and after a very elaborative discussions on the entire aspect of renewable energy, right from the technology to the finance, we have come to the closure of this side event that we had organized on the eve of, on the sidelines of the third energy transitions working group, which is exactly happening in the next room, the deliberations and the discussions on most of the key topics that were discussed today in terms of what are those technologies that are going to lead to us to accelerated energy transition. What is the cost of finance that we need to lower to make this happen? What is the amount of finance that is required to actually make the entire energy or achieve the global net zero that we call about? So it was on behalf of the Government of India, the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, and the supporters of this event, IRENA and IREDA. I take this opportunity, and it's my pleasure to thank you all, those who attended physically to this session and obviously on the virtual link as well. We had a massive request for actually getting this side event streamed live. My special thanks, let me thank Secretary, Ministry of Power, Secretary, Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, the Principal Secretary, Energy, Government of Maharashtra, the Chief General Manager, Reserve Bank of India, the Chairman and Managing Director, IREDA, to actually grace the plenary session and start the beginning of this, the low-cost finance for new and emerging technologies session. So actually, the nest of the two sessions were quite brilliant because I personally learned a lot, and the way the things were articulated, the kind of exposure that the panelists had in terms of moving forward from what we are today in 2023 towards a scenario where we all can take pride about the way the work we are doing. And every corporate, whether it's private or public or a multilateral development bank, I think everybody is striving to contribute to this global aspirations of net zero and trying to reduce the emissions that we talk about. My special thanks to Ms. Gauri Singh, Deputy Director General, IRENA, for her moderating this session and talking the aspects on the outlook of new and emerging energy technologies. I would also like to thank Mr. Dan Donner, Head of the Strategic Initiative Office, International Energy Agency, to moderate the second session on role of international financial institutions and multilateral development banks in mobilizing investments. I'm sure we have a lot to take away from this session. We have a lot to actually deliberate further on how we, individual, sitting in this room and listening to this, can contribute in making these things happen. So with the reports that were launched, I think will bring in more insights to all that was discussed, and I'm happy that the reports are available for your consumption and reading. And actually, we will, in the next room, we will be discussing those recommendations that have come out or emerged out of this report. I would like to thank the entire team of IRENA. I would like to thank IREDA team, who have been actually putting a lot of effort into this session for the last several weeks, and my team members from the G20 desk of the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, who have made this event happen. So ladies and gentlemen, I invite you for a lunch which is just waiting for us at the outside of this hall, and then carry on the offline discussions as we take forward. Thank you very much. Look forward to seeing you in the tomorrow's session. Thank you.